Hello and welcome. My name is Michelle Mason, and I'm a Policy and Operations Assistant at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. I want to thank you for joining our virtual panel on prosecutors and innovative responses to violence. This panel is a part of a series of virtual panels that the IIP has been hosting since the COVID pandemic has shifted us to remote operations. I want to invite you all to our upcoming panel on July 24th, where we will be discussing prosecutors and prison conditions. Additionally, I am pleased to announce that the IIP will be releasing our Vision for a Modern Prosecutor statement tomorrow, which was developed by elected DAs and criminal legal experts from our executive session. The statement outlines an innovative vision to which all modern prosecutors should aspire. Please follow us on our socials, which is at IIP_John J, to stay updated on the IIP's latest news and events. Before we begin our panel, I'd like to read our Living Land Acknowledgement statement, honoring both the land and culture of Indigenous peoples across our country. We want to acknowledge that the IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoping, the Lenape homeland. We honor all Indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the Indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. I would now like to introduce today's moderator, Tyler Nims. Tyler Nims is the Executive Director of the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, also known as A More Just NYC, which is a group of civic leaders that seeks to help the City of New York move towards closing the jail complex on Rikers Island and to advance the broader systemic changes needed to achieve that goal, including improving the functioning of the criminal justice system, reducing incarceration, and changing the way the city treats those who remain incarcerated. Please join me in welcoming Tyler, and please put any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and Tyler will include them as time permits.
Thanks, Michelle, and everybody. I'm so grateful to have the chance to be part of this discussion here with you all today on an incredibly important set of issues with a group of panelists who have each accomplished an incredible amount in their careers. So I'll start with those introductions. Lucy Lang is the director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She previously served as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where she investigated and prosecuted violent crimes, including domestic violence and homicides. She currently teaches criminal justice in New York prisons. Sheri Boston is the district attorney of DeKalb County, Georgia. She's one of 4 female district attorneys in the state of Georgia, and among that rare 1% of African-American females who currently serve as district attorneys nationwide. Since taking the helm as DA in 2017, she's assembled a diverse, highly experienced team to assist with restructuring, redefining prosecution processes, and the office has also increased its capacity to serve victims with an expanded victim service unit. Alec Karakatsanis is the founder of Civil Rights Corps, which is a nonprofit dedicated to challenging systemic injustices in the US punishment bureaucracy. He's helped to lead nationwide challenges to some of the core features of our society of mass human caging, including cash bail, the criminalization of poverty, and prosecutor misconduct. He's the author of the new book, Usual Cruelty, which I recommend to you all. And Wesley Caines, finally, is the Chief of Staff at Bronx Defenders. He spearheaded the organizational systemic reform efforts, including overseeing policy, impact litigation, and community organizing teams. Before joining the Bronx Defenders, he worked at Brooklyn Defenders and launched the Records Accuracy Project, which used local law students to identify and correct rap sheet errors. In his roles, he's worked closely with directly impacted communities, and he's trained many law students in criminal legal reform. All right, so we'll get to these great panelists soon, but to start off and put some context around our discussion, I want to acknowledge three things that provide the backdrop. First of which is that, as I think and hope most of you know, the United States today is an outlier around the world, even across our own history when it comes to the number of people who we incarcerate. We've got more people in our jails and prisons on a per capita basis than any other country by far. And we've got about 7 times more people in our jails and prisons today than we did 50 years ago. So there's been a growing focus on reversing this situation, but actually doing so is going to involve digging into really challenging questions about how we deal with violence in our society. 60% of people in state prisons, for example, who are the largest portion of people incarcerated in our country, have been convicted of offenses including violence or weapons. So I think that calls attention to the need for new ways of thinking about these subjects. The second point is that this conversation is taking place during ongoing, intense, and nationwide protests about racial injustice and police violence that were sparked by the killing of George Floyd and many other people. So while I expect this conversation is going to focus mostly on violence within communities by private individuals, we have to acknowledge that government actors have been involved in violence in our communities, and also acknowledge that this violence has disproportionately impacted Black people and other people of color, and acknowledge that the discussion is occurring in the context of a broader, significant role that race plays in shaping who wins and loses in our society. And then finally, the conversation is occurring amidst an increase in gun violence in New York City, where I'm based, cities across the country in recent weeks, and also more broadly in the economic freefall, the social trauma caused by COVID-19. So as that context, I hope suggests there's a ton at stake in the issues that we're going to talk about today. So let's get started. I'm going to send my questions to individual panelists, but encourage all of the panelists to jump in. And as Michelle mentioned at the beginning, for those in the audience, if you have questions, and send them in by chat, I'll try to work them into our discussion. So let me start with a question for you, Lucy. How big of a problem is violence in America? What's its impact, and how much of it gets handled in the criminal justice or criminal legal system?
Thank you so much for that important scene setting, Tyler, and to all of my fellow panelists for being willing to be a part of this really thorny conversation that I hope we're going to have. I'm so thrilled to see so many of our partners from across the country who've tuned in to attend. Thank you all for being with us today. There's no question that violence is on the rise right now in New York City and other big cities. This June, Manhattan had the most shootings since 2006. Last week, there were more shootings than, there were 3 times more shootings than last week, last summer. That said, it has to be kept in the context of the incredible decreases that we have seen over the course of the past generation. Crime rates actually have fallen more than 50% between 1993 and today. And so it's very difficult to talk in the aggregate about rates in crime going up over a course of period of weeks when we have seen such a significant decrease over a long period of time. And I think that it's also important when we talk about cities like New York, not to talk in percentages, but to talk in real numbers, because the numbers really had become so low that to talk in percentages perhaps inflates the sense of concern around it. That said, communities are of course right to be concerned about violent crime. There are about 1.2 million violent crimes reported nationwide annually, and each one of those is a real person with real families, and that's important to bear in mind. That said, I think it's worth also noting that that's based on reported crime statistics, and it is impossible to know how much violent crime goes unreported and therefore totally unaddressed by the system. And that's an important backdrop for this conversation as well.
All right, so I want to direct the next question to Sheri and to Wes. And Sheri, in your experience as a prosecutor, and Wes as somebody with background in public defense and in organizing with impacted communities. What are the causes? What are the things that are driving violent offenses, or just violence, period, I should say? And what does that mean for how we should seek to prevent and to heal violence as a country?
I'll allow Sheri to go.
Thank you so much for driving this really important conversation. I would say, you know, what we're seeing around violence in America really is a cycle. And it's a cycle of violence and a cycle of trauma. And much of the violence that we're experiencing is the result of this cycle that we have to figure out how to break. And they are systemic issues connected to these areas around food insecurity, poverty, a lack of education system, lack of health of services, violence in the home, trauma that children are experiencing as youth, both in the family and in the community, are having lasting effects on them as they're growing up. So much of our talking about so many people that are experiencing it over and over and over again for them and in their family history. And so that, of course, is finding its way into the criminal justice system, a space that has become the place to unfortunately address violence in the community, where we need to be making sure we're looking at resources to disrupt violence and trauma in the community before it results in actions that brings itself naturally into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I would like to first of all thank IIP for hosting this conversation, which I think is quite timely and necessary. I would echo some of the sentiments of Sheri when she speaks to violence on in an expanded way. We normally have a discussion around violence, around interpersonal violence, and I would challenge us to really extend the notion of violence to institutional violence, government violence, resource violence. When we talk about lack of quality education in certain communities, that's the historical thing that Sheri is talking about. When we talk about lack of medical and mental health services, those are institutional, drivers of violence. Those are, our criminal legal system prosecutes and holds accountable individuals for their acts of alleged violence. But there is no comparable mechanism for bringing in our government and institutions into an accountability system to say, hey, lack of resources in very intentional communities, right, is a driver of trauma and eventually violence. So I would want to challenge our listeners to really consider that violence is yes, a serious interpersonal challenge that should be eradicated, but what drives that interpersonal violence is also systemic violence, and that systemic violence stems from government policies that are quite frankly racist. And it places certain communities at a disadvantage. It places certain communities in a survival mode. And we all know when people enter survival mode, it's very difficult to think equity and to think community and to think we have a shared, understanding of what it means to be safe in a particular community. People are looking out for themselves. They're looking out for their family members. So yeah, I would like to stretch our understanding of violence a bit today. Thank you.
Lucy, Alec, do you want to weigh in on this? Or before I move to the next question?
Well, I would just say that I think that the definition of violence is an important one here, and the legal definition of violence is highly variable by state, but oftentimes when we're looking at numbers, we are including things like stealing something from a Duane Reade that happens to be attached to an apartment building, which constitutes a burglary because it's adjacent to a dwelling. And was that really a violent crime? Not, I think, in the layman's sense of the word. So I do think that there are distinctions in how we're talking about things, and that the context that Wes has just laid out is critically important.
I'd add a couple of points that might be a little bit more provocative. I mean, I think I was probably invited here because I have a little bit more radical views than most on these issues, and I hope that my observations will be of use, even though you might not agree with all of them. But I would challenge us to go even further than Wes just did, although I agree with everything that Wes just said, and to understand that violent crime is really a socialized concept. It's constructed. Different societies at different moments in history consider different things to be violent. For example, in our modern American criminal legal system, the term violent has largely been defined by people who own things in our society, by white people. So you have a definition of violence that is serving the interests of wealthy white people throughout the modern history of the American criminal system. And so what does that do? What does that mean? Well, it means that so many things that I would call violent, that think of as sort of structurally violent, are not considered violent at all. So for example, home foreclosures of families that can't afford to pay their mortgage payment, or evictions of families that can't afford to pay their rent. I think of forced evictions backed up by the force and violence of the state. I mean, the group that executes evictions in our society are armed with handcuffs and metal chains. And there are millions of families that are evicted from their homes every year. We actually know from some groundbreaking public health research that that tens of thousands of people's deaths every year are correlated with them losing their housing. Housing leads to death. We know that. Another form of violence that we don't talk about a lot is exposing children to lead in their water, exposing people to poverty, barring people from accessing healthcare because they can't afford it. To me, these are all things that a society might reasonably call violent, because they're all being enforced at the end of the day with the force and violence of the state. The force and violence of the state is what means that if I'm hungry on any given day, I can't just walk into a store and take food that I need for my family. It means that a city like Los Angeles can have more vacant second homes and luxury condos than people who don't have a home. And it's the violence of the state that prevents someone who doesn't have a home from walking into a vacant luxury condo that someone has as their second or third home. That's violence to me. And so when we talk about violent crime, we are already so limiting the conversation. Another thing that Wes was gesturing at that I want to put a little bit more explicitly maybe is that there's so much violence perpetrated by the state that, and I think Lucy alluded to this as well in some of the opening remarks. When someone is arrested for, let's say, possessing a plant that's on a list of plants they're not permitted to possess, they are taken away from their family in metal chains. That has happened 37 million times with respect to the marijuana plant, for example, since the rise of mass incarceration 4 decades ago. In each one of those cases, someone is separated from their children, their loved ones, their family, their school, and their home, and they're put into a jail environment that is quite violent. We don't actually count this in our violent crime statistics, but there are a tremendous number of sexual assaults and physical beatings that happen to people in jails. When the DOJ has examined the police departments throughout this country, let's just take the Newark Police Department, just to take one recent example of DOJ findings, they found that over 90% of all of the police stops and searches were completely unjustified. Those are tens of thousands of physical assaults on people that aren't being counted in police statistics of violent crime. There's so many ways. I could go on and on. I think you get the point of where I'm coming from, at least politically, but there's so many examples of violent crime that don't incorporate. There's so many examples of violence that aren't incorporated in our socialized conception of crime that actually do much more harm to people. Way more people in this country die because they are forced to live near a place that pollutes their air and their water than die from violent crime. 450,000 Americans die every year from tobacco, including 50,000 who die from secondhand smoke alone. That's 15 September 11th every single year, easily preventable. And so our conception of what we force each other to endure and what's violent and what's considered nonviolent are something that I think I urge us to interrogate if we really care at the end of the day about a broader, more holistic conception of public safety.
So I think we're hearing a lot about, or what I'm hearing at least, is questions about how we define violence, what the violence that we talk about when we talk about violence really means in the context of a much broader spectrum of the way our society works, and a disconnect between the social causes and context for violence and the individual accountability or the individual processes that occur in the context of a criminal justice system. And I want to get, I think, I want to get down the road to ways that we could start to change some of those bigger picture issues, both in the individual sense of the way the legal process works, and more broadly. But before going there, I think I'd like to hear a little bit more from the panelists about what the current response is. Maybe traditional is not the right word, but what are the current responses to violence or violent offenses in America, and whether those responses are effective, have they been effective, and then the costs that have they been worth the costs? And I'll turn that to Sheri and then Alec and then the rest of the panel.
So I think what I'm hearing you say, Tyler, when we talk about the traditional response, I think everyone kind of understands the traditional response was kind of law and order, lock everybody up, which has led to mass incarceration and not a disruption of the cycle of violence and trauma. Law and order didn't do anything more to make us safe than today than it was when we were throwing around these terms in the 80s. And so as someone that is a part of a movement to reimagine the role of prosecution within the criminal justice system, how do we proceed with stemming violence while also serving our victims of violence at the same time, which, as pointed out really by Wes and Alec, and we know the data shows within the criminal justice system that the perpetrators of violence are commonly and oftenly also victims of violence as well. So what do you do there? And so when we talk about the traditional ways, we need to throw those out the window because they're not serving the communities that we are looking to uplift and change. We have to dig into what really the issues are behind the violence, and we have to come up with ways of holding offenders accountable in a way that also addresses the systemic issues that may be the root and cause of the reasons behind the perpetrated violence. And that's why it's so important to address societal issues, systemic issues. We have to talk about, alcohol and drug abuse. We have to talk about mental health issues. We have to talk about the trauma that children who then become adults experience when they are victims of domestic violence or sexual assault in the home. We also have to talk about the trauma that children experience before they become adults, when they witness violence in their communities, whether it's gun violence or gang violence or homicides. Seeing that level of violence as a child has a traumatic, lasting, ongoing systemic effect that can't be unseen. So we have to figure out why we are not treating those traumas with the counseling and the services and the things that these children need, because before they become adults who have spent their entire lives being rooted and raised in a way where they have been affected by a violence that they probably don't even understand has affected how they see and view the world. So in prosecution, we have to start talking about these things. We have to see people beyond a name and a number. We have to understand what they've experienced and how that's a part of how they perceive the world that they live in. And if we don't do those things, if we just continue to put people in jail, throw away the key, and say, serve your time, this is your punishment, we will never, ever solve the problem of violence in our community, because prison is not the answer. Prison perhaps is a place where we feel like we need to send people for punishment, but prison is not treatment. We've got to talk about the services and the things we need to do to rehabilitate our community and to offer them many times the services that they have never received as they've grown in community.
I think that Sheri's response is a very good segue into what I wanted to say. I mean, let me first start by saying that the reason that I don't think that our traditional, what you're calling the traditional approach to violence has been effective, is that I don't actually think responding to violence was ever the goal or function of the modern American criminal system. I think its function was something much different, probably more insidious, to control and surveil certain groups in our society, to maintain and preserve the wealth of other groups in our society, and to maintain a system of white supremacy. And I recognize that's a fairly radical view, but if you look at the history of for example, police forces and the professionalization of police forces in this country, what you'll find is that they were a response to runaway slaves, and that they were also a response to busting organized labor in the beginning of the 20th century. And that's how police forces really got their start. And once police forces became more powerful and more politically, motivated, and they started concocting other justifications for their own existence and to metastasize their size. And what we've now seen since President Nixon decided to really propagandize that metastasization with rhetoric like the war on crime and the war on drugs, and then of course it was expanded by Reagan, what we've seen is a justification of so-called violence. Again, it's a very narrow conception of what violence is, as the main raison d'etre for police departments and for the criminal punishment system more broadly. But what's fascinating is, if you look at like the FBI statistics, only 5% of all police arrests in this country are for things the FBI calls serious violent crime. 95% of what they do is not that. So I think it's very important to understand one of the reasons why so many prosecutors and so many public defenders and so many judges and so many victims advocates and so many people around the country are concluding that the criminal system is not a good way of responding to the violence that we're seeing in communities, is that most of the criminal system was never designed to respond to that violence or to address it in any meaningful way. Every major study by the National Academy of Sciences and criminologists for the last 50 years has concluded there is absolutely no relationship between the length of a sentence and deterrence, for example. Many of the concepts that have underlied the dramatic expansion of the punishment bureaucracy in this country have nothing to do with empirical evidence that they work, let alone that they are the best intervention, the least costly, the one with the least collateral consequences, right? We don't have any empirical evidence at all that, if you care very deeply, as I do, about sexual assault, domestic violence, physical assault, the kinds of things that impact people's lives and that create trauma, if you care very deeply about that, you want to see some evidence that caging someone who commits that act is actually going to lead to a society where less of that act happens. And we don't have any evidence of that. I think it's because of what Sheri and Wes were saying, which is that the things that actually cause that to occur, these cycles of trauma, of deprivation, of poverty, of alienation, of lack of relationships, they stem from things like toxic masculinity, poverty, lack of relationships between people, lack of investment in communities. These are things that are preventable, but that aren't connected to punishment. They're connected to much deeper social forces. They're connected to lead poisoning for children, which actually on a 20-year lag is actually the thing that's most correlated with so-called violent crime, is how much were the children in that community exposed to lead. All kinds of things that we haven't really thought about as part of our response to so-called crime. The other thing I want to just note is that many of our responses to crime are the result of pure propaganda. So, Lucy opened this by saying that there's been a rise in shootings, but then Lucy, I think correctly noted right after that the rise that police are talking about in terms of percentages is actually quite low as an absolute matter. When police from one year to another in a city talk about a dramatic increase in the number of shootings or murders, they're talking about several dozen instances, which actually are skewing that result because crime is actually so low. And so these several dozen instances are dwarfed by the number of people who die from easily preventable causes like texting while driving, or air pollution or water pollution, or cigarette smoke, or alcohol use. So like, if you really care about like saving the most number of lives, you would be devoting the billions of dollars that we're devoting to police to other interventions. And so I think it's critically important that we take a long, hard look at what most of the criminal system is doing. We opened this by talking about 60% of people in state prisons there for violent offense. That statistic is quite misleading, as someone in the Q&A notes mentioned. I was talking with our friend Vinny Schiraldi at Columbia Justice Lab recently, who used to run probation in New York, and he was telling me, a lot of people don't realize that many of the offenses in state prison that are called violent are actually people who've been sent back to prison on probation or parole violations for technical offenses. They're still coded as a violent offender, but the reason they're in prison now is a technical violation, not even a new offense. That is 25% of all state prison admissions in this country. Another 15% or so is low-level offenses committed by people who had prior serious offenses. So even when we think about those numbers, they're very skewed by people who have an interest in making you think that the criminal system is all about combating violence, when the vast bulk of the infrastructure that's been set up doesn't do that, even to the point where it ignores many violent crime, as many of the famous studies have shown in the last few years, where there's an extraordinary number of untested rape kits in many major American jurisdictions as police have focused on things like drug enforcement. I'll just stop there, but I did want to add that to the, I think, insightful comments that Sheri made.
I would just like to add and totally echo what you both have said. The notion that there's been a response to crime or violence is totally false. And for all of the reason that Alex stated, we don't respond to violence in a community by examining, the quality of education in those communities. We don't respond by asking about are there food deserts in those communities. We don't respond by saying what is the trauma history that could be addressed in those communities. So, our law enforcement infrastructure is literally in urban areas about controlling Black and brown bodies, both historically and currently, and in rural areas controlling poor white bodies. And if you look at our prisons and jails, those are the people most represented in those systems. And here's the tragedy. The tragedy is we have built out a system of controlling Black and brown and poor white bodies that now makes it very challenging to turn this ship. because the system is so bloated, it now feeds on itself and has to justify itself. So more and more of the arrests, the vast majority of arrests that take place are not even classified as violent anymore. In New York City, most arrests are for misdemeanor offenses. Most are correlated tightly to poverty. And, because the system is so big, we have, almost 39,000 police officers in New York City, and this plays out across the country. We have court officers, we have corrections officers, we have the people who are connected literally to this industry who has a vested economic interest in maintaining the status quo. So the people who are out in the community now protesting and utilizing state violence as a mechanism for conversation and saying we want this to change, they're not only talking about policing. They're talking about in all areas of our lives where, government systems reinforced by privilege has really created in our country a unequal, inequitable society that really punishes poverty and punishes Black and brown people simply because they're Black and brown.
I'm reminded of the story of a colleague of mine who served 15 years in prison for a fatal shooting he participated in at 16. And upon his release was picked up at the doors of a New York State prison by people purportedly sent by his family, driven a few miles down the road where they pulled over, someone got out of the trunk and shot him. As a prosecutor, to me, that is an absolute indictment of the 15 years that he spent in prison, ostensibly in an effort to respond to the crime that he had participated in. And I think that all the prosecutors on the call can probably relate to the shooting cases that come in and a victim who testifies in the grand jury, only for you to have a call from a detective within weeks saying that the victim of that shooting had just been arrested for retaliatory shooting. So this raises the question that Alec is getting at, I think, about how we define violence. It matters so much because it asks us who is responsible for this. And what I admire about Sheri and other DAs around the country is that they are not simply saying, well, not me, my responsibility is simply processing the cases that are brought in, but trying to think about the sort of systemic inequities that everyone has pointed to and think about violence interruption and prevention and ways to reimagine how we respond to tragic incidents in a way that doesn't then perpetuate the vicious and tragic cycle.
So Sheri and Wes, I think, and I think all the panelists have brought up a number of important issues about how we define violence and how we talk about it. And Sheri, something you said that folks who are perpetrators are very often people who have been victimized by violence in the past. And Wes, one of the things that, or maybe both Alec and Wes, we talked about prison as a solution to problems of violence, but prison is itself a form of violence. And there are many who say, and I tend to agree, that the ultimate end of prison is exacerbating or encouraging some of the factors of trauma and poverty and isolation that give rise to violence in the first place. But I do want to shift a bit to the perspective of people who have been victims of violence or survivors of violence, and not just them, but their families and the broader communities, and the impact that interpersonal violence does have. Leave aside the social context and the social conditions in which it occurs. So Wes and the other panelists, who is impacted by violence? And I guess I'm defining it a little more narrowly here as the interpersonal violence that we often think of when we think about violence. Who's actually impacted by us, and how does the system address their needs, or how does it fail to address their needs?
Yeah, great question. I think we're all impacted by violence, by interpersonal violence. More specifically, I think the individuals who are perpetrators of violence, who oftentimes were previously victims of violence, I can tell you that in certain communities, it's like a thin line between victim and perpetrator. And, you know, the system responds in prosecuting, you know, the alleged perpetrator in any particular incidents. But then after that's over, the families of the victims themselves, the family of the convicted person, I mean, the community is left without anything to do with that, without any opportunity to process that. So I think that, you know, as someone who has personally spent a quarter century in New York State prisons, I can tell you that prisons are not transformative. People who come out of prisons come out in spite of prisons, not because of prisons. And so, you know, so the question becomes, what happened in communities where out of necessity, there's some holding of account for someone who has been convicted of an offense? People exist in a context, they exist in community. And when we don't think about the context or the community by which from which they come from, I think that's the perpetration, that historical cycle that Sheri has been speaking about, that really just replicates itself. Yeah, so I think we're all impacted by violence. I think we're all impacted by, you know, our culture's response to violence, which is usually just to extract, you know, alleged perpetrators and to, you know, create a sainthood around a victim and move forward without thinking about those that are left behind, the community that has to deal with that. And what does that mean for that young child, to Sheri's point, that sees that violence, experiences that violence, have family members who were impacted by the violence, and now whose behavior and whose, you know, engagement in community has been altered. I think those are questions that we haven't really unpacked and grappled with, and issues that we haven't really, you know, been willing to address, because we tend to not see, you know, alleged perpetrators as fully people, especially when they're Black and brown. And there's a sense that Black and brown communities, especially the Black community, has been so traumatized for 400 years that they can handle it, so that there's no professional intervention that's needed. There's no trauma-informed trauma care that's needed. You know, that community can handle it because they have always handled it. And I think that's a great tragedy.
I think this is a good segue to talk about how we can address that interpersonal violence, where people that experience violence or perpetrating violence, whether they're going to prison or not, are oftentimes going back to the same communities, where they perhaps shop in the same stores, live on the same streets, will find each other intersecting in their normal lives. And so one would say, you know, how do we, when you ask the question, who's impacted by violence, and Wes made a very good point, we all are, because folks are having to go back in these same communities where they know each other. And so I think this is where we continue to have discussions on how we can bring restorative justice and restorative justice models into our community, into our criminal justice system, because the backbone of that is to resolve perhaps underlying trauma, underlying conflict between a perpetrator of a crime and a victim of a crime that perhaps share the same community space. And we need to resolve those issues, because sending someone to prison for a year or even 2 years and that person coming back into the community doesn't resolve those underlying issues. And I give a lot of, I want to give props to DA Dan Satterberg out in King County, Washington, in the Seattle area, because he has really done a lot of work in building out this model. And I'm following that work in a sense that we would really like to have that be a more robust model in my jurisdiction. And just to give you an example, when you talk about violence, a concrete example of where we've had these conversations of how can we solve the issue. And we had a particular case where we had a horrible tragedy happen where a 3-year-old was the victim of a drive-by shooting. The 3-year-old was in the back seat of a car. The juvenile that committed the homicide thought he was being shot at by another vehicle, and he grabbed a gun out of his family's glove compartment and shot back. But this stray bullet went into another vehicle, and sitting in the back seat was a 3-year-old that ultimately died. And so what I've seen about this case is we have 2 families that live in the same community. The family of a 3-year-old who lost, you know, a life very tragically. And then you have a family of a juvenile at the time was 15 years old who effectively is losing their child. And it's the question is, and then we ended up with 2 feuding families. That every time we had court, every time there was a hearing, you had these 2 families that were angry with each other about what was happening in the criminal justice system and what happened to a child that was no longer here. And as a result, we started having these conversations because these people shared the same space. They were fighting on Instagram. They were running into each other into stores. And the trauma was continuing. The violence, the anger was all still there for people that aren't even involved in the case. And so that's what I say when I agree with Wes, because it wasn't limited to the 2 people that was actually involved in the scenario. It scooped up 2 entire families that now continue to fight one another, which is why we started talking about, would a restorative justice circle be something that would be beneficial, not just for our 15-year-old, right? But for both of these families that feel very hurt and disturbed and upset and traumatized by this singular incident. And so we have to realize that we have to look into the roots of those issues and understand that the death in this case expanded and traumatized way more people than most would identify as the direct victims in this particular case.
So Sheri, you know, one of the things I noticed as I was reading out your bio is that that your office has a focus on a victim, or a renewed focus on a victim services unit. And I'm curious, with the scope of all the problems that we've identified here in this discussion, or started to identify, what is that specific? What's your vision for that kind of unit? Is it in a sort of much more broader role? Is there a broader role for that type of concept in addressing the cycles that you mentioned?
Absolutely. When I took office, our office had a total of 9 victim witness advocates. And essentially, when you have such few people in that role, given the size of our jurisdiction and the number of victims we were seeing, there was a triage process saying, okay, we can't do everything, so we're only going to handle, for their purposes, the highest level or the most, what they perceive to be the most traumatic cases, which I think we can all agree that only falls in the range of a death, a murder, a homicide, perhaps sexual assault cases or child molestation cases. But as everyone pointed out, that left out a very large swath of victims that needed to address underlying traumas and needed assistance in understanding the underlying traumas. And so I'm happy that we were able to expand our services, honestly, over threefold. We now have 21 victim advocates in our office to work with victims. And it's not just for us is, yes, we work with victims that come into the criminal justice system, but we also work with victims who for whatever reason, their matters or their trauma is not bringing them into the courtrooms. They are identified in the process because perhaps they're seeking assistance, whether it's a temporary protective order or a stalking order or a domestic violence order, where they're asking for civil protections, but for various reasons don't want to engage in the criminal justice system. And so we now have the ability to make sure that every victim in our community that seeks assistance, we can try to help them or refer them to a community-based advocate. We partner very extensively with our community-based programs because we believe that they can offer tremendous resources outside of the criminal justice system as well. And so we have a very victim-centered focus, which is we want to make sure that we are providing our victims at every time with all of the resources that they need to protect themselves and to address the trauma, because we know that coming to court and closing out a criminal case does not end or solve the trauma of any victim. Many victims may think, if I come to court and someone's found guilty and they go out the side door to jail, that somehow they're going to feel this rush of relief and that it's all going to be restored. What we know is exactly the opposite, and that victimization is still going to exist until we address the underlying issues. So it was really important for us to do that, and I'm very proud that we have invested a lot of resources into our victim witness program, and we have an amazing director, Chastity Rogers, who spends a great deal of time of making sure that our advocates are equipped with resources and utilize self-care to make sure that we can effectively be there for them as we walk in their shoes.
I think that's a good segue into shifting towards the discussion of, what should the future look like? And I'm thinking, and particularly with respect to the prosecutor's role, and I'm thinking, in the near term. So, we've talked about a lot of the context for these challenges. And I also want to bring in a couple of the questions that we're receiving here, which I think are relevant to this. So one person who's, expressing the view based on her experience in a prosecutor's office, that many folks believe that by the time a case comes to them, it's too late for the prosecutors to really solve any of the problems that have led to the issue. And then another question is very related is, given all the shortcomings of the criminal justice system and criminal legal system, given all the shortcomings of our society, what can prosecutors do to interrupt the cycle that put the case on their desk in the first place? So those are two questions from the audience, but I direct them to you, Lucy, in the beginning, and then to everybody else here. What are changes that can happen in the immediate term in terms of how prosecutors are approaching cases, with a goal towards non-punitive or certainly much less punitive responses?
To any prosecutor who feels like it's too late by the time a case comes to their desk, then I would just challenge them to expand their imagination and undertake some of the kinds of strategies that Sheri has just described and that some of her other colleagues are undertaking. Think about something like when a gun possession case, for example, comes across someone's desk. Now, in New York State, we have mandatory minimums on those cases and can only plead them down to 2 years once they're indicted. Of course, there are ways around that, and we're seeing some prosecutors starting to use creative ways to ensure that there's swift, fair, and certain response to gun possession crime that involves pro-social programming and credible messengers. And I think that going to communities and employing community resources, including credible messengers, is an incredibly productive way to try to curb the tide of violence. And gun possession cases are an obvious place to do that, but it can be true in a whole swath of other kinds of cases. So know to the young prosecutor, it's not too late. When the case lands on your desk, it is an opportunity. It should be an opportunity to problem solve. And I commend the DAs who are thinking about ways in which they can think about their mandate as being a problem-solving one, separate and apart from a punitive one, because of course, accountability can mean a whole range of things. The restorative practices described, the programming described, and it's exciting to see so many district attorneys, and of course, it really is probably a very small swath of them, but to see district attorneys starting to see that as part of their vision for the future.
I would just say that, you know, there's a lot of talk on panels like this about change and about you know, doing things differently, and there's whole organizations devoted to innovative prosecution. But from what I'm seeing, and I think all of that is very important, these are conversations that weren't happening 15 years ago when I started working in this area. But I'm seeing very little actual change on the ground. And the vast bulk of prosecutions that even so-called progressive prosecutor offices are impoverished people for low-level offenses that do not involve violence at all. And very few prosecutors are taking resources away from that. And at best, that work can be described as callously contributing to racist and unjust systems. That's the best thing you can say about the vast bulk of what most of these offices are still doing. Again, I understand my views might be considered radical or offensive. I feel the need to say it. The types of innovative things that Sheri was talking about are just not the bulk of what her office is doing. And it's not the bulk of, and she's probably the best of the bunch around the country on these practices. And I had this discussion the other night with my friend Chesa Boudin on another panel, who's now the DA in San Francisco. For example, when we talk about victim services, the problem of wage theft by employers, by conservative estimates, dwarfs by a factor of 10 all other property crimes in this country combined. Theft, shoplifting, burglary, robbery. Very few DA's offices are prosecuting wage theft by employers. It's just not seen as something they do in the criminal system. And none of them, to my knowledge, are using their victim services departments for that kind of crime. There needs to be a total reconceptualization, and yet all of those offices are still prosecuting low-level drug offenses. That is, people who are possessing substances that are on a list of substances they're not allowed to hold, or else they'll be separated from their children by force and put into the criminal punishment bureaucracy and caged, where they're likely to get sexually assaulted and contract an infectious disease in the pandemic. This is the reality of what most of these offices are doing. And so if we are serious about devoting attention to so-called violent crime, I think we would be casting aside the vast bulk of what prosecutors' offices are currently doing and devoting the kind of resources, staff, money, to the instances, the smaller number of instances, but still way too many, where one human being has harmed another human being. And one of the reasons that we haven't seen this developing more significantly is that it's not seen as a priority in most prosecutors' offices in terms of budgetary and staffing decisions. And so I challenge those listening, those involved in these offices, put your money where your mouth is. Stop prosecuting low-level offenses that are based on poverty, that are based on drug use, drug sales. Devote all of those resources to things like victim service, to things like restorative justice, to concocting and developing and then refining strategies that actually deal with the harm and trauma that arise from instances of interpersonal violence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the question, where do we go from here in the short term, for me is a bit problematic in that framing that we would want prosecutors to address things that are so broadly systemic. Fact of the matter is prosecutors are not going to open their coffers and transfer resources to daycare centers in the community, childcare services, where parents can go to work without feeling as if ACS is going to try to separate the family because there's a 13-year-old watching a 5-year-old while mom try to do 2 or 3 hours of work or shopping, right? A prosecutor's office is not going to transfer resources for youth activities in a community that would give young people, activities, productive activities. So, in the short term, I think prosecutors definitely have a role to play. To Alex's point, the vast majority of prosecutions literally should not be in court. And when the police bring people into the system, whether through summonses or through arraignment, they should literally be walked out the front door and cut loose. But communities have to be examined for where there is a lack of resources. And I'm not sure that prosecutors are going to be willing to transfer the resources that they have into the communities that they have jurisdictions over to fill the gap that other government agencies have divested from, right? And at the very least, I think in the short term, prosecutors, though, could identify those shortcomings and say to, local electeds that this is a problem. And we don't believe that weaponizing police against Black and brown and poor communities is the answer to this. And how we're going to address that is we will not prosecute these cases. We will choose not to expend resources in prosecuting people for smoking marijuana, possessing marijuana. We will choose not to prosecute people for things that are clearly poverty related. And I think in the short term, once we get a groundswell of prosecutors courageous enough to do that and to respond to communities, not at the moment of or post some heinous event, but to be embedded in the community, to understand the communities in which they have jurisdiction, not just coming in with investigators after an offense has taken place and looking to disrupt then, but maybe looking before that, embedding themselves in communities to have the legitimacy of the community. So when they speak out against lack of resources, there's a credible messenger in themselves there.
I want to just respectfully disagree a little bit with Alec, and I believe that we started practicing on opposite sides of the aisle almost at exactly the same time, and recognizing that none of the change is happening fast enough. I do believe that there has been significant change. A number of big city district attorneys' offices, including in DeKalb County, are processing far fewer cases than they did 10 years ago and beyond. Offices are starting to winnow down the kind of cases that they are willing to accept. That said, I have real concerns about prosecutors just saying, well, that's not my problem, and so I wash my hands of it. I think what's really required here is interagency collaboration, and one real challenge that is unique to the American system, because our prosecutors are elected as compared to all of our other agency officials, is that public health officials don't have the same kinds of political pressures on them to respond to issues which they rightly should, including drug use and homelessness and the other sorts of things that have unfortunately gotten wrapped up in the criminal justice system. So to my mind, a responsible prosecutor who is seeking to meaningfully respond to what Wes has called for, and with which I agree, needs to be doing it in a thoughtful, evidence-based way in collaboration with other agencies who have resources and expertise.
So I want to just follow up on what Lucy said, and I do want to push back a little bit on what Alec said. And here's the thing: there is no magic pill that we can take and reframe and readdress what has been built on a criminal justice system that started 400 years ago in the wake of systemic racism and pushing people that have low socioeconomic status to the bottom of a system. There's no magic pill. Obviously, if there was, I think we'd all be willing to take it, swallow it, drink the water, and make it all right. But change takes time. And I will say that when I look at some of my colleagues like Kim Fox in Chicago, or Rachel Rollins in Boston, or Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore. These are all women that were elected on progressive platforms that committed from the very beginning to actually stop using resources in their offices to deal with these low-level misdemeanor nonviolent offenses. Instead, they committed to focusing on the more violent crimes in their offices that were truly harmful to their communities. And for me, it's a little different because we are a felony only office, and we don't prosecute misdemeanor cases. But having said that, these are also all women that have faced enormous amounts of criticism, to include death threats, for vocalizing their unwillingness to continue to prosecute in that traditional way, and their unwillingness to prosecute those low-level offenses that they believe are harmful to their communities. And so I say that to say is that there are people that are truly committed to transforming the communities to which they serve, and being leaders for others to say, you too can do this. And I will say it is not easy to operate in that space when you are perhaps one of the only elected prosecutors in your entire state that is creating policies and modeling it in that way. I can honestly tell you the number of instances where the vast majority of elected prosecutors in my jurisdiction will not support these initiatives. In fact, will push to make sure that those that are trying to talk about this change, that the laws preclude us from doing that. Not to mention that we have an attorney general who has openly criticized those that want to do the things that you're talking about as people that aren't doing their job, should be removed from office, and are now using a narrative that we are causing more violence in our community by refusing to do the jobs that we were elected to do. I say all that to say is that change takes time, and it's not singularly ever going to be solved by one entity. It can't be solved by public defenders. It can't be solved by community alone. It can't be solved by prosecution alone. It will take every aspect of our community and all of us together to work to fix these issues, because the problems are underlying and systemic. The problems are education. The problems are poverty. The problems are racism. These are all things that we can't solve alone. But what I can commit to doing is my part. And I feel my part is bringing a light to how we can transform and do things differently within a criminal justice system, to continue to fight for victims and hold violent offenders accountable where they need to be held, but also offer up an opportunity to understand that not everyone belongs in the criminal justice system, and that even if you have been in the criminal justice system, that should not be a red mark on you forever, and that there's got to be a way to re-enter people back into society so that they can be successful.
Just to respond to that briefly, I think we have a real problem in the movement, and this is why I wrote the book Usual Cruelty, which talks about this at more length, but there's a real propaganda surrounding progressive prosecutors. We just heard Sheri mention that Kim Fox and a number of other prosecutors are focused solely on the things that are really hurting their communities and not low-level offenses. Kim Fox increased the number of drug felony prosecutions every year she was in office. It's just not true to say that she's not doing that. And I'm all for prosecutors being less cruel and prosecuting fewer of those cases, but the fact of the matter is the vast bulk of the criminal punishment bureaucracy is still alive and well under Kim Fox in Chicago. And so too are all of the prosecutions for low-level offenses, the prosecutions that are linked to poverty and race. It's just not true to say that's what Kim Fox and Marilyn Mosby are doing, because I've looked at the data. I've looked at what they're doing. I've been to those jurisdictions. I've worked there. And so I'm not trying to be overly critical. I think those prosecutors are among the people that are doing the best around the country. But when the scope of the problem is so enormous, it's not helpful to talk about those people as if they're, quote, transforming things. They're not transforming anything yet. Those people are largely being a little bit less cruel than their predecessors and promoting the exact same punishment bureaucracy that got us here in the first place. And I think it's misleading and dangerous to talk about it as if it's some kind of transformational change when it's not. And that disconnect between how we talk about reform and what's actually happening to change the massive, I mean, the criminal punishment system in this country is almost exactly the same size as it was the moment this progressive prosecutor wave started getting elected a few years ago. Almost exactly the same number of people incarcerated, more people on supervision, more people on electronic monitoring. It's just not accurate to say that we've made these kinds of changes, even in places like Chicago and Baltimore. And I think that's I worry that we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about people who aren't doing transformational change as if they are.
I guess that's where we'll have to agree to disagree. And while I'm not here to argue data with you, because I'm sure you have it, what I can say is the folks that are committed to changing the system have been committed to raising these issues in their communities and raising these issues across the country and instituting change that they believe will best affect their communities. And instead of focusing on criticizing the very few people that are doing this work, we need to continue to lift them up in a way that we force others to do this work, because it won't be resolved by one DA in one city in one state. It won't happen that way. When you are the lone outlier who has to fight tooth and nail to even do what you're trying to do, we need to make sure we support them in this movement instead of criticizing and saying it's just not enough. It will be more when we have more voices standing next to each other saying, let's uplift this work and let's take it to the next level. It can't happen overnight, and it certainly can't happen if we're criticizing the folks that are literally putting their lives and their families' lives on the line because they receive death threats to change the system.
So, I think we're getting into some really interesting, provocative, illuminating discussions here, particularly as there are differences in views between the panelists. Unfortunately, that also means it's 10:15 or 12:15, so we're getting closer to the end of this discussion. I guess I want to just observe a couple things. One is, I think both Sheri, Lucy, and also Alec have been talking about some of the political challenges that are involved here, both in terms of changing people's minds about what's going on in our society, and also the political pressures in the other, which is increasingly something that's coming, I think, increasingly powerful, but also the pressures that are coming from the other side on many of the district attorneys. And as somebody noted, we have this strange, we talk about this as a system, but to the extent you can even talk about an individual jurisdiction as a system, you've got, several thousand different counties across the country, each with its own elected prosecutor. And all of those counties are going in different directions. I think some folks on the Q&A challenged some of Alec's data in terms of their own specific, but certainly, the numbers are what they are in every jurisdiction. And the picture that we see, I think, is not of the extent of the change that at least I, believe would be meaningful or even start to be meaningful. Wes, I'd like to give you the last word here in terms of, however you want to respond to the recent debate, and maybe in particular, what are your aspirations for seeing how the prosecutors in the Bronx or across the country are dealing with this sort of what we narrowly talk about as violence? And then we'll turn it over to Jonathan Terry for the for some concluding remarks.
Sure. Thanks again to IIP. This was a great discussion. Great panelists, very passionate. I love it. Prosecutors are a piece of, they're not the whole of this issue. And a response to this issue is going to take a lot more than prosecutors. It's going to take a lot more than police reform. It's literally going to take a social reform. And, you know, I want to just put it out there. Maybe it's time for a constitutional convention. The fact is, I know that there's a lot of movement around repealing the 13th, but frankly, the Constitution was built on white supremacy for propertied white men. And maybe it's time that, you know, a more, you know, broad spectrum of members of our society to come together and have a new constitutional convention and re-envision what a multicultural nation that's not built on the backs of property ownership and privilege can possibly look like. And then creating a document that, you know, we can all, you know, debate and sign on to. So I know that's super big outside of the scope of even this panel discussion, but I think unless we have folks who are willing to put that into the ether, you know, we won't be imaginative enough to really consider that this is not the only way that we can choose to govern and order our society. And unless we reinforce that with some action, unless we repeat that and start to believe that, then the status quo is always going to win. You're going to have one-off prosecutors, one-off police chief, one-off mayors who are looking to do something, but in this big ocean of our society, it's going to be very hard to change the tides of where things are going and where things have historically gone.
Thanks to all the panelists, and you know, just I'm grateful to be part of this. I think it's obviously an evolving, crucially important set of conversations. Jonathan, do you want to do the concluding remarks? Wait, let me say also, I know there's a ton of great questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, you know, so a lot of good stuff and a lot for the future.
Thank you for that, and thanks to everyone for a spirited conversation. I'd like to end today's panel with a reading from James Baldwin's Letter from a Region in My Mind, which reads, "Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness within others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time."